Sometimes the most dangerous truths hide in the quietest places, not in grand pronouncements or dramatic gestures, but in the small details that almost go unnoticed. The position of a hand, an almost invisible object, a choice so subtle it could pass for accidental. In 1897, a family in Virginia posed before a camera and made one of those choices. They wore their best clothes, behaved with dignity, and placed something in the hands of their youngest son that would carry a message for over a century. For 127 years, that message waited. Until a researcher, restoring the faded image with modern technology, realized what the child was holding and understood that it had never been just a family portrait. If you enjoy untold stories from the past, mysteries hidden in old photographs waiting to be unveiled, subscribe to the channel and click the like button, because what you're about to discover will change the way you see all the old photos you've ignored. Dr. Amara Johnson didn't expect to find anything unusual when she accepted the digitization project from the Virginia Historical Society in February 2024. She specialized in photographic restoration, taking damaged 19th century images and bringing them back to clarity using high-resolution scanning and digital enhancement. Most of her work involved repairing tears, removing stains, and adjusting exposure on portraits that had faded over decades of improper storage. The photograph arrived at her lab in Richmond on a cold Tuesday morning, sealed in archival protective sleeves. The accompanying paperwork was minimal. Family portrait, circa 1897, Petersburg, Virginia. Donor, estate of Dorothy Hayes, deceased 2023. No additional provenance information available. Amara removed the photograph carefully and placed it under her examination light. Standard studio portrait. A black family of 6, father, mother, and 4 children, ranging from perhaps 15 years old down to about 7. They stood on the porch of what appeared to be a modest wooden house, the kind of dwelling common to working families in the late 19th century. Everyone wore their Sunday best, the father in a dark suit with a watch chain, the mother in a high-necked dress with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, the children in carefully pressed clothes that showed signs of having been mended and maintained with care. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would suggest this image was anything other than what it appeared to be, a family preserving their likeness for posterity, as thousands of families did during that era. Amara began the scanning process, setting the resolution to capture every possible detail. The technology she used could reveal textures and elements invisible to the naked eye, pulling information from the silver halide crystals embedded in the original photographic paper. She had used this same process hundreds of times before. The scan took 40 minutes. When it completed, Amara opened the file on her computer and began the enhancement process, adjusting contrast and sharpness to bring out facial features and clothing details. She zoomed in on the father's face first, then the mother's, then moved systematically through each of the children. And that's when she stopped. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, standing at the front right of the group, held something in her small hands, something Amara had missed entirely when examining the physical photograph. The object was small, roughly circular, made of what appeared to be brass or bronze, and engraved on its surface were markings that Amara recognized immediately, even before she zoomed in closer to confirm what she was seeing. It was a compass, but not just any compass. Amara increased the magnification until the compass filled her screen. The detail was extraordinary. Her equipment had captured every scratch, every engraving, every imperfection in the metal. The compass itself was old, far older than the photograph. The casing showed signs of extensive use, the kind of wear that came from being handled repeatedly over many years. But it was the symbols engraved around the edge of the compass that made Amara's breath catch. She had seen these symbols before, in her research on the Underground Railroad. Not the famous, well-documented routes that textbooks described, but the lesser-known networks that had continued operating even after the Emancipation Proclamation, helping Black Americans escape from areas where violence and exploitation remained endemic despite the legal end of slavery. The symbols were directional codes, a series of small markings that, to the untrained eye, might look like decorative flourishes or manufacturing marks. But Amara knew better. Each symbol corresponded to a specific direction, a specific landmark, a specific safe house. They were a portable map, encoded in metal, designed to be carried by conductors and guides who led people north to safety. The compass in the child's hands wasn't a toy. It wasn't a family heirloom kept for sentimental reasons. It was a working tool, which meant this family, this apparently ordinary family photographed in 1897, 32 years after the Civil War ended, had been part of something dangerous, something that required codes and secrecy even decades after slavery was officially abolished. Amara sat back in her chair and looked at the full photograph again. The family stared back at her, their expressions serious and composed, as was typical for photographs of that era when exposure times were long and subjects had to remain perfectly still. But now, knowing what the child held, Amara saw something else in those faces. Not just dignity, but determination. Not just pride, but defiance. This photograph had been posed deliberately. The compass had been placed in the child's hands intentionally. Someone wanted this moment recorded, this evidence preserved. But why? And why give such a dangerous object to the youngest member of the family for the photograph? Amara pulled up the donor information again. Dorothy Hayes, deceased, 2023. The photograph had come from her estate, but there was no indication of how Dorothy had been related to the family in the image, or why she had kept this particular photograph for her entire life. Amara reached for her phone and called her colleague at the Virginia Historical Society. "I need everything you can find about a Dorothy Hayes," she said, "and I need to know who this family was." Within 3 days, Amara had assembled a small team. Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian specializing in post-Reconstruction Virginia, joined her to analyze the historical context. Lauren Chen, a genealogist with expertise in tracing Black American family lines through fragmentary records, began searching for any documentation that might identify the family in the photograph. Marcus arrived at Amara's lab on Friday afternoon, carrying 3 books and a laptop filled with scanned archival documents. He examined the enhanced photograph for nearly 20 minutes before speaking. "Petersburg, 1897, he said finally. "That's significant. Do you know what was happening in Virginia at that time?" Amara shook her head. "Systematic disenfranchisement," Marcus explained. The Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1901 to 1902 would officially codify Jim Crow segregation, but the groundwork was being laid throughout the 1890s. Poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, all designed to strip black citizens of voting rights they'd gained during Reconstruction. Violence was increasing. Lynchings were common. Black property owners were being driven off their land through legal manipulation and outright terror. He zoomed in on the father's face in the photograph. This man is standing in front of his own house, dressed in a suit, presenting his family with obvious pride. That alone was an act of resistance in 1897 Virginia. But if he was also running an underground railroad route? 32 years after the war ended, Amara interrupted. Why would anyone still need the Underground Railroad? Marcus pulled up a document on his laptop and turned it toward her. It was a newspaper clipping from 1899, reporting on a case in rural Georgia where black farm workers were being held in debt peonage, essentially slavery by another name, using manipulated debt to trap workers on plantations under conditions that differed from slavery in name only. Because freedom on paper didn't mean freedom in practice, Marcus said. Across the South, particularly in rural areas, black Americans were trapped in systems of labor exploitation that were barely distinguishable from slavery. Some tried to escape north, to cities where they might find actual wage work and some degree of safety. And some people like this family perhaps, helped them. Lauren entered the lab, carrying a folder of documents. "I found Dorothy Hayes in the 1940 census," she announced. "She was born in 1918 in Petersburg, Virginia. Her maiden name was Garrett, and I found earlier records for a Garrett family in Petersburg going back to the 1880s. She laid out a series of photocopied census pages and property records. "I think I know who they are." The census records told the story in fragments, the way most black family histories from that era were told, through scattered documents, incomplete information, and names that appeared and disappeared from official records, depending on which white census taker happened to visit in which year. But Lauren had pieced it together. The family in the photograph was almost certainly the Garretts. Joseph Garrett, age 42 in 1897, worked as a carpenter. His wife, Dinah, age 38, took in laundry. Their children, Samuel, 15, Ruth, 12, Esther, 9, and Clara, 7, the girl holding the compass. Joseph Garrett purchased his house and the land it stood on in 1889, Lauren explained, pointing to a property deed. 2 acres just outside Petersburg city limits. He paid cash, $140, which was a substantial sum for a black carpenter in Virginia at that time. Marcus leaned forward. "How did he accumulate that much money?" "That's the question," Lauren said. "His carpentry work alone wouldn't have generated that kind of savings. Not in Petersburg in the 1880s, where black workers were systematically underpaid. So either he had another source of income or someone was helping him financially." She pulled out another document, a handwritten ledger photocopied from the archives of a Petersburg church. "This is from the First African Baptist Church, where the Garrett family were members. It shows donations made to the church between 1885 and 1900. Joseph Garrett's name appears regularly, giving small amounts. But look at this notation from 1888. Amara read the entry. Anonymous donation for Travelers Aid Fund, $50. "The Travelers Aid Fund," Marcus said slowly. "That was code. Churches in the South used that language to describe money set aside for helping people escape. It was how they documented assistance to fugitives without putting anything explicitly incriminating in their records." "And the next property deed Joseph Garrett signed," Lauren continued, "was in 1892, when he purchased an additional acre adjacent to his existing property. The notation says the land included a small barn suitable for storage. Marcus and Amara exchanged looks. A barn on the edge of town, purchased by a man with mysterious financial resources and connections to a church traveler's aid fund. A barn that would have provided shelter for people traveling through, people who needed to stay hidden. They were running a station, Amara said. The Garrett house was a safe house on a post-war underground route. And that compass, Marcus added, pointing to the enhanced image of Clara Garrett's hands, was how they navigated it. Over the following weeks, Marcus uncovered a pattern. Using church records, property deeds, and the fragmentary accounts of families who had migrated north during the 1890s, he began mapping what he called the Invisible Railroad, a network of safe houses and guides that operated long after most people assumed such networks had disbanded. The routes didn't follow the same paths as the pre-war Underground Railroad. Those routes had been designed to move people from slave states to free states to Canada to places where slavery was illegal. But by the 1890s, slavery was illegal everywhere in the United States. The routes Marcus uncovered were designed for a different purpose, moving people from areas of extreme danger to areas of relative safety, from rural Alabama to Birmingham, from plantation country in Mississippi to Memphis, from the cotton fields of Georgia to Atlanta, Richmond, or Washington, D.C. It wasn't about crossing a legal line anymore, Marcus explained during one of their evening research sessions. It was about getting people out of situations where they were trapped, by debt, by violence, by systems designed to keep them in place. A family might escape a plantation where they were being held in peonage. An individual might flee after witnessing a lynching, knowing they could be next. Young men might run from areas where they were being targeted for convict leasing, arrested on false charges, and sent to labor camps that were death sentences. The Garrett family's location made strategic sense. Petersburg sat on the railroad line between Richmond and the deeper South. People escaping from North Carolina, South Carolina, or Georgia would pass through or near the town. The Garrett's house, slightly outside town limits and backed by woods, would have been an ideal stopping point. Far enough from the town center to avoid constant surveillance, close enough to the railroad to facilitate the next leg of a journey north. But the compass suggested something more sophisticated than just providing temporary shelter. The symbols engraved on it indicated specific directions, specific landmarks. Someone had created a tool that could be carried and referenced, a portable guide that would work even if the person carrying it couldn't read written directions. Amar had sent detailed photographs of the compass engravings to Dr. Helen Washington, a historian at Howard University who had written extensively about resistance networks in the post-Reconstruction South. Helen's response arrived via email on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into the investigation. The symbols you found match a coding system I've seen referenced in 2 other sources, Helen wrote. But I've never seen an actual physical example before. This compass is extraordinary. Can we meet? Dr. Helen Washington arrived in Richmond on a rainy Saturday in March. She was a woman in her 60s with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She examined the enhanced photographs of the compass for nearly an hour, occasionally making notes in a worn leather journal. "I need to tell you about the lantern bearers," she finally said. The name meant nothing to Amara or Marcus, Helen explained. In the 1890s and early 1900s, there was a loosely connected network of black families across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina who maintained safe routes for people escaping debt, peonage, and violence. They called themselves the Lantern Bearers, a reference to carrying light in dark places. They operated in complete secrecy. No membership rolls, no written records, nothing that could be seized by authorities and used to prosecute them. She pointed to one of the symbols on the compass. But they did use codes, symbols that could be marked on trees, drawn in the dirt, or engraved on objects like this compass. Each symbol represented a direction or a landmark. This one, she indicated a mark that looked like a tree with 3 branches, meant follow the creek north until you reach the triple oak. This one, a circle with a dot in the center, meant safe house with food and shelter. "How do you know this?" Marcus asked. Helen opened her journal and showed them a page covered in similar symbols. "I've been collecting these for 15 years. They appear in family Bibles, carved into barn doors, sewn into quilts. Always fragmentary, never complete. But this compass," she shook her head in wonder, "this compass contains a complete route. Whoever made this encoded an entire journey from somewhere in rural Virginia to Richmond, maybe 30 or 40 miles, with every safe house and landmark marked." She looked up at Amara. "Do you understand what this means? This family didn't just help people occasionally. They were active, experienced conductors. They had a complete map, and they were trusted enough that someone, probably another conductor or a network coordinator, gave them this compass." "Why would they pose with it in a photograph?" Amara asked. "Wasn't that dangerous?" "Extremely," Helen agreed. which is why I think this photograph was never meant to be seen by white people. I think it was documentation for the network itself, proof of who the Garretts were and what they did, a record for other lantern bearers or for future generations who would need to know this history. Lauren's genealogical research had uncovered something remarkable about Clara Garrett, the 7-year-old girl holding the compass in the 1897 photograph. She had lived to be 94 years old, dying in 1984 in a nursing home in Philadelphia. And she had left behind an oral history recorded in 1979 by a graduate student working on a thesis about black migration from Virginia to northern cities. Lauren obtained a copy of the tape from the University of Pennsylvania archives. The recording quality was poor, but Clara's voice came through clearly, the voice of an elderly woman speaking about events 8 decades in the past. "My father used to take me with him when he traveled," Clara's recorded voice said. "We would walk at night, through the woods and along creeks. He carried a lantern, and I carried, well, we called it the guide, a small brass compass with markings on it. Father taught me to read those markings before I could read words. 'This is north,' he would say. 'This is where the road crosses the creek. This is where you turn toward the morning star.'" The interviewer's voice asked, "Where were you going on these walks?" There was a long pause on the recording. Then Clara spoke again, more quietly. "We were meeting people. People who had walked for days, sometimes weeks, to get away from places where they couldn't live free. People who were running from men who wanted to hurt them or trap them, or worse. My father would meet them at certain places. There was a hollow tree 2 miles from our house, and a clearing near a creek, and a place where 3 paths met. He knew when to be there because people would send word through the churches. A visitor would mention a Bible verse in a certain way, or a woman would wear her shawl folded in a particular pattern. Codes, all of it. Secret ways of talking." "And you went with him?" the interviewer asked. "Sometimes, when I was older. I was small and quiet, and no one paid attention to a child. My father said that was useful. If someone stopped us, I was just a daughter on a walk with her papa. But I knew the truth. I knew what the compass meant. I knew the people we met in the woods weren't ghosts or travelers. They were people running toward freedom, and we were helping them find the way." The tape continued, but Amara had to pause it. Her hands were shaking. They hadn't just found evidence of a network. They had found testimony from someone who had lived it. The oral history contained one more revelation near the end of the recording. Clara's voice had grown tired, but she spoke with clarity about a specific night, the night the photograph was taken. "It was the summer of 1897, Clara said on the tape. "I remember because it was hot, terribly hot, and we were all dressed in our Sunday clothes even though it wasn't Sunday. Mother had spent days getting those clothes ready, washing and pressing them. She said we needed to look our best because we were having our photograph made. The photographer came to the house. That was unusual. Usually people went to a photographer's studio. But Father paid him to come to us, and he set up his equipment on our front porch. Father told me to hold the compass, to hold it so it showed in the photograph. I didn't understand why. I was 7 years old. I just did what I was told. Years later, when I was grown, my mother told me the truth. That photograph was made the day before my father's last mission. He was going to guide a group of 12 people, 12 all at once, which was more than he'd ever done before, from a plantation in North Carolina to a safe house in Richmond. It was dangerous. The plantation owner had hired men to hunt for anyone who tried to leave. Father knew he might not come back. So he had the photograph made, as a record, as proof that he'd done this work, that our family had been part of this. And he wanted me holding the compass because I was the youngest. Because if something happened to him, the compass would pass to Samuel, my oldest brother, and Samuel would teach me everything Father had taught him. The work would continue. There was a long silence on the tape. When Clara spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. Father did come back from that mission. All 12 people made it to safety, and Father came home 3 days later, exhausted but alive. He took me aside and said, "Clara, you did well. You held that compass steady as a stone." And I knew then that I was part of it, part of something bigger than our family, part of a promise that we would keep helping no matter how dangerous it became. The interviewer asked one final question. "Do you still have that compass?" Clara's answer was quiet. "I did, for many years. But I gave it to my daughter before I left Philadelphia. I told her what it meant. I hope she kept it safe." Lauren worked backwards from Clara Garrett through census records, city directories, and church registries. Clara had married in 1912, taking the name Clara Holloway. She had 3 children, one of whom, a daughter named Dorothy, was born in 1918, the same Dorothy Hayes whose estate had donated the photograph to the Virginia Historical Society. It took Lauren 2 weeks to locate Dorothy's daughter, Clara's granddaughter. Her name was Joyce Holloway Patterson, and she lived in Silver Spring, Maryland. Lauren called her on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Joyce answered on the 3rd ring. She was 68 years old, recently retired from a career as a public school teacher. When Lauren explained the reason for her call, that researchers had found something extraordinary in a photograph Joyce's mother had donated. There was a long pause. "The photograph with the compass," Joyce said finally. "I know the one. My mother kept it in a box with other family papers. She never talked much about it, but sometimes she would take it out and look at it. I asked her once what was special about that picture, and she said, 'That's your great-great-grandmother holding something important.' But she never explained what." Lauren asked if Joyce's mother had kept the compass itself. Another pause. I think I might have it. After my mother died, I sorted through her things. There was a small wooden box with some jewelry and a few other items. One of them was an old compass, brass with strange markings on it. I didn't know what it was for. I kept it because it looked old and interesting. 3 days later, Joyce drove to Richmond and met with Amara, Marcus, Lauren, and Helen. She brought the compass in a velvet pouch. When Helen unwrapped it and placed it under examination light, comparing it to the enhanced photographs from 1897, there was no doubt. It was the same compass, the same markings, the same tool that Joseph Garrett had used to guide people to freedom, that he had placed in his daughter's hands for a photograph meant to preserve their legacy. Joyce touched the compass gently. "All these years," she said softly, "I had something my grandmother held when she was 7 years old, something her father trusted her with. I wish I'd known. I wish my mother had told me." "She probably didn't know the full story herself," Helen said. "These histories were kept quiet for so long, even within families. But now we know, and now we can tell it." The photograph was formally accessioned into the Virginia Museum of History and Culture's permanent collection in September 2024. It was displayed alongside the compass, now on loan from Joyce Holloway Patterson, and accompanied by an exhibition titled "The Lantern Bearers, Post-War Resistance Networks in Virginia." The exhibition opening drew more than 300 people. Descendants of the Garrett family came from across the country. People who had never met before, but who shared a common ancestor in Joseph, Dinah, Samuel, Ruth, Esther, or Clara. They gathered around the photograph, looking at faces they'd never seen before, learning stories that had been hidden for generations. Marcus gave a presentation about the historical context, explaining how the networks operated and why they remained necessary decades after emancipation. Helen spoke about the coding system and the courage required to maintain such operations in an era of increasing violence and surveillance. Amara described the restoration process and the moment she first noticed the compass in Clara's hands, but it was Joyce who gave the final speech, standing before the photograph of her great-great-grandparents and their children. "For most of my life, I didn't know this story," she said. "I knew my family had come from Virginia. I knew they had moved north during the Great Migration, but I didn't know they had been conductors. I didn't know they had risked everything to help others escape violence and exploitation. I didn't know my great-great-grandmother, when she was just 7 years old, stood on that porch holding a compass that represented a promise to keep guiding people toward freedom." She paused, looking at the faces around the room. Descendants, historians, educators, students. That little girl couldn't have imagined that 127 years later, her photograph would be in a museum, that researchers would decode the symbols on that compass, that people from all over the country would come to learn about what her family did. But I think she would be glad, because the whole reason they had that photograph made was to create a record, to make sure that someday, when it was safe, the truth could be told. Joyce touched the glass case protecting the photograph. "The promise my great-great-grandfather made, the promise to help people find freedom, that promise has been kept. Not just by him, but by everyone who worked in secret to guide people north, by everyone who kept these stories alive even when they couldn't speak them aloud, by everyone who remembers." She looked at the compass, its brass surface gleaming under the museum lights, its symbols finally understood. "Now we all carry the light," Joyce said. "Now we all know the way.